Hello, everyone. Let me adjust this really quick. I'm a giant. Okay, perfect. We all good? We can hear me? Cool beans. Well, welcome to my talk. I really appreciate all of you being here. This is something I'm really excited to talk about. So we're going to talk through. I got an alert. Now what? First of all, this is me. My name is Kellon Benson. I work at Red Canary as an incident handler. So when stuff catches on fire, I help put it not on fire. And when things aren't on fire, we're helping people just improve their security posture. There's some other things about me. Love some pop punk and some emo, so come find me later and we can talk about Midwest emo and maybe jam on that. I have been alleged with creating the word front. I don't know if it's true, and I'm very sorry that word exists. So that's me. Let's actually talk about some cool stuff. Oh, actually, sorry. If you want to get a hold of me, find me after my talk, but also Twitter's the best way to get a hold of me. I have a LinkedIn. I don't use it because LinkedIn is only good for phishing. So I got an alert. Now what? This stems from a question that I got from some people who are newer in information security, asking me questions about like, I have this pile of alerts. What do I do with them? Do I just like search the hash and then if the hash is clean, I'm good? And I was like, this is actually a really good question. But my initial response was a horrible response. And that initial response is, well, you investigate your alert. And then I said, you're doing that thing that people with experience do where you don't actually explain how to do what you actually need to do. Anybody been in that situation before? Any seniors out there? Okay, no head, some head nods. Okay. So I decided this would probably be a good time to check my methodology, write it out, and also share it with other people. This is my methodology. That doesn't necessarily mean it's perfect, and we'll have discussion about that later. But it was a good way to step back and put that together, because I think we lose track of that as people with experience. Sometimes we don't necessarily know how to explain the things we do. And sometimes we have gaps we don't even realize until we go through and write out our process. So that's kind of what this presentation is all about. So thank you all for coming to listen to this. All right, brief overview. When we get an alert, we'll talk through that. We'll talk through what is the alert telling me. That's an important step. You can't really investigate something if you don't understand what you're looking into, as well as what's interesting in this alert. What are the things that I can pivot off of? We're going to talk about, is this actually a threat, or am I just looking at a blinking red light and feeling scared about it? And if it's a threat, then what do we do with it? And then we'll talk through some what if situations. We're going to live in a nice, perfect world as we investigate this, which we all know is not the case when you're necessarily doing this in the real world. All right. So we have an alert. Don't panic. Everything's going to be okay. We get alerts all the time, I'm sure. And when we get an alert, we're going to end up with a little bit of information. Sometimes it depends on where we're getting our alert from. Some providers give us a lot. They tell us exactly why this alert fired, the logic behind it. And that's really helpful because you know exactly what you should be looking for. Sometimes you just get a brief piece of information that says something along the lines of, Excel launched a suspicious program, and you get a command line. Maybe that's helpful, maybe that's not. And you have to then take that and act on it. So the first thing we need to do is understand what our alert is telling us. And why this alert fired. So we have our alert that said Excel launched a suspicious program. So if we have that, we need to kind of dial that back and ask the question about, what is this alert? Why did it fire? It could be something along the lines of, we have a logic that's looking for Excel launching a suspicious program. That's really exact. That's a very precise alert. That could be a thing. It could also be that it's looking for a Office product launching a suspicious program. And we also need to figure out, what does suspicious actually mean? And why did it fire here? So let's dig into that to understand if those things actually happened and if this alert is something that we should really spend our time looking into. Excel launched a suspicious program. We can, if we open up that alert, perhaps we'll get some context around what's happening. It depends on our data source. If you have a SIM or an EDR, maybe you can track that process tree through a nice graphical representation. Maybe you just have event logs and you have to go search through event logs and track your parent processes around. And perhaps you don't have either of those things and you have to do something a little bit more manual. This talk is mostly focused on our methodology here. We're not going to dig super far into tooling or anything along those lines. So let's say we hop into an EDR and we see Excel launched redserve32. We have our command line there and we get a hash of the file that Excel opened. That's something that I'd want to take note of just to dig into a little bit later. Right now, I'm just trying to confirm, hey, is this program suspicious and what's happening here? And in order to do that, we actually need to understand what redserve32.exe is. You may know off the top of your head. If you don't, we get to go to the internet machine and figure out what's going on. Redserve32 was launched. What is this? If this was me, I would go just Google redserve32, see if I can get to some official documentation, which we can. We can land on a Microsoft doc, and it tells us exactly what redserve32 is used for. We discover that it registers DLL files as a command component in the registry. Should Excel be launching that and then leading to commands being registered in the registry? Maybe. We're going to have to figure that out. That's part of this investigative process. We need to understand if this is suspicious, why. I would say, if this was me, this is pretty suspicious behavior. And we can see likely a command line of this. Oh, geez. We can likely see a command line of this when we're digging into the processes and understanding what Excel launched. This redserve32 has a command line of -s.efhj.dll, and we can get a hash of that. This DLL could be interesting. It could be very normal. Does this EFHJ stand for something? Maybe this is a very legitimate DLL. Perhaps this is arbitrarily named and is containing malicious things. We don't know. That's part of this process and why we're looking into these things and triaging this and trying to figure out what comes next. Let's pause, take note of what we have so far as we've done some first steps in investigating. We have found an Excel file. We have a hash of that Excel file. We have a DLL. We have a hash of that DLL. And we have a hash of redserve32 as well to look into. I want to understand what this redserve32 is doing, if it's legitimate redserve32 and those sorts of things. I also want to understand what this Excel file is. But before that, something I want to touch on is if you're looking into the process tree that stemmed from this redserve32 coming from Excel, you're likely going to end up with something that looks like this spider web or a rabbit hole. It's very easy to see something like this and then dive down that rabbit hole and forget that you're supposed to be like triaging this alert, understanding if it's that like something you need to worry about. And then you lose time and you get like 30 minutes in and you're like, oh, should I have escalated that or maybe done something on this endpoint? So just keep that in mind as you dig into alerts. You got to take that time. You need to understand when you're going to go down a rabbit hole and cut yourself off. I've been in situations where I've done the rabbit hole thing. I think a lot of us probably have. And it's tough not to do. So if I were in this situation and I saw these things, I would probably just keep it in a tab and come back to it later, or take note of all the hashes of these things that I'm looking at here and then save that for later, because we could waste a lot of time here. So we have our points of interest. We have a rabbit hole that we're ignoring. Those points of interest are things that we can look into to establish more context and gain more understanding of this alert and the things that are going on. I'm going to call these indicators of compromise potentially. We don't know if we have a compromise, but we're going to call them IOCs. And obligatory pyramid of pain. So if you're not familiar with the pyramid of pain, it's incredible. You'll see it forever and always in InfoSec until something replaces it, which I hope it never does, because I love seeing it on slides. So the pyramid of pain is essentially indicators of compromise in order of easiest to detect and find and act on and then as you go up the pyramid, it becomes harder to find and detect these things. So in our In our example, we have some hashes. So those are going to be pretty easy to define as indicators of compromise and use in the future. Now, when you jump into things like host artifacts, tooling, or tactics, techniques, and procedures, it becomes a little bit more difficult. Turns out tracking human behavior and the way humans do things on computers can be hard. But nevertheless, it can be an indicator. So with what our indicators are, we can take those hashes and potentially look them up. Slap in VirusTotal for the win. But wait, I'm going to soapbox really quick. If you're going to check files online, make sure you're just going to search for your file hashes online. There's a very big distinction between uploading your files to VirusTotal and searching that hash. If you didn't know that, now you do. And when you upload something to VirusTotal, there are some risks that you are accepting. One of which is, if that's something that is part of your company, you could be putting company data on the internet for people to see. That's probably bad. You now have 2 security incidents. That's also bad. So bear that in mind. Additionally, this one's a little bit less, we could argue about it over a beer or something, is you could alert the adversary that you know they're there and you know that their tooling is there, and they could be watching VirusTotal looking for, okay, we need to switch our payloads now or something along those lines. That's a thing to be aware of, but it really depends on your context and what you care about. Just have that in mind. So instead, just search your hash. It's a lot easier and significantly less risk. And if you search that hash, you're likely going to get some kind of result. Something else I'm going to touch on is have a policy and procedure around this at the place you work and make sure people know. So that way people aren't uploading things to VirusTotal and you're not having a bad day. Does anybody have like policy and procedure around this, or it's known to not do this at your workplace? I see some hands, I see some nods. Cool. For those of you nodding, is it written down? If it's not, you should do that. You now have homework. You're welcome. It just makes things a little bit easier. And that way it's documented for new people when you move on and retire and do like a houseboat or something. So, all right. Soapbox over. Just search your hashes. We're going to search these hashes and going to figure out what's going on here. What kind of information can we glean from open source intelligence about this and help us determine, is this a threat? So our first one we're going to do is register 32 because it makes sense. We're going to make sure that this is what it says it is. And we search this file on VirusTotal. We can see that, hey, this is a file distributed by Microsoft. It's clean, it's safe, which means we can close this alert, pack it up, and go home, right? No, don't do that. Just because something is clean and safe doesn't mean that it can't be used for evil on the computer. There's a whole slew of things called lolbens or lolbaz, depending upon which website you go to, which is living off the land binaries. These are all things built into an operating system that attackers can use. This is distributed by Microsoft. No vendors detected as malicious, but it can be used for evil. I've seen this play out in situations where alerts have come in for suspicious encoded PowerShell, strange command line, and the investigative process was this. Google the hash of PowerShell, check the hash of command. Those are clean, close out the alert. A few hours later, really bad day, really bad day. So just keep that in mind and share that knowledge with people, because some people just don't know that. And it can really help your junior analysts come into a place where they're making good investigative choices. But you don't know what you don't know. These other hashes, though, very clearly evil. Mermaid Man tells us this, so we know it to be true. So when you search these hashes on VirusTotal, you're going to get this bright red, scary result, which means, hey, we may have a threat here. We may have something going on. And I think that's pretty good information for us moving forward as analysts to say, all right, we're going to move forward as if this is a threat. We need to get some more understanding of what's going on here and what our threat is. Who is the threat? If you don't get this reference, please go watch Pokemon from like the original series. Maybe just one episode. Give it a chance. It's great. So who's that threat? And I don't mean, is this wizard, lizard, spider? Is this Russia? Is this some nation state? I mean, what is our like threat family that we're dealing with? I don't think that it's necessarily going to help you knowing if this is APT 175, but knowing who that threat is and what family it's in is very helpful. We can argue about attribution as well. I'm just setting up a lot of arguments at the bar later. Please don't find me. So how are we going to figure out who that threat is? Well, my usual go-to is looking at the alerts and the information about definitions that might fire on the files that we looked at. And VirusTotal provides us some real great information on that. When we search those hashes in VirusTotal, both came back with similar results. And on that detection page, there's information that says, well, it's hard to see, but it says it's Emotet. So all those things say Emotet. The fact that this page was lit up with the word Emotet, my brain says, this is probably Emotet. So I would move forward as such. Now, going back a little bit, if VirusTotal doesn't have answers, there's other places you can get answers with open source information about file hashes. Malware Bazaar, great place to look up hashes and get information about if something is malware. If that hash is there in the Malware Bazaar, it's probably malware. The other cool thing is they tag their malware so you can see what families it's associated with, so you can get a better idea of what you might be dealing with if perhaps VirusTotal doesn't have something. Additionally, Triage, great tool, same kind of thing. It does take an account though. It's free, but you have to have an account. And it provides really good information. Highly recommend checking out Triage. You get some like process trees, pretty pictures, graphs. It's great. One of my favorites. We're going to call our Pokemon Emotet. Probably fire fighting type, aggressive. So we'll operate under that. So we know who the threat is. The who is Emotet. Now we need to understand what is the threat. These are two different things. They may sound similar, but they're not. The what is, what's our behavior here? What is this threat going to do? What do we have to worry about? What are its objectives? What could be the impact that we're going to have in our organization? Those are very important questions to answer as you go through determining how to deal with an alert. Because if there's a small impact, it kind of changes your urgency. If it's large impact, could it result in ransomware? Well, that's going to change how you deal with this and your urgency with which you push it forward or deal with remediation. If I want to understand what is Emotet, I'm going to Google it. I'm going to shamelessly plug Red Canary's threat detection report. I will say it's fantastic. I say that coming from a place where I used it before I was at Red Canary. Absolutely love it. The information's good. Recommend checking it out. Good stuff there. So if I jump into the Red Canary threat detection report, there is information on Emotet, and it provides some really good baseline information to figure out what exactly I'm dealing with. The bolded stuff is probably the most important bits of understanding what we're dealing with here. So it's a downloader or dropper of other malware. Okay, so if we have Emotet, we might have something else. So it's a gift that keeps on giving. That's fun. And it's going to steal user data and banking credentials, which I bet you it's going to steal more than just banking credentials. That's its focus. But hey, if there's creds, we're probably going to take them all. So you now understand what the impact could be to your organization. You have user data being stolen and your credentials being stolen, very likely. The other thing I want to point out here is it's disseminated through malicious email, links, or attachments. That's a good piece of information to hold on to for when you get into your remediation steps. Because if this was delivered through email, you likely have some stuff in your inboxes you're going to need to deal with. We'll get there. All right, we have a threat on our hands. We understand that we have malicious payloads that came from Excel. Our alert was valid based on what we're seeing here. So Excel launched a suspicious program that launched files that returned a malicious hash. Okay, we see that those hashes are associated with Emotet. Emotet brings more malware, bringing its friends along. It also wants to steal your credentials. I would say we have a threat on our hands. Then what? What do we do? Probably a few things. And to make sure I don't miss any of these things, I need to flip in my notes. Our steps here are going to be response. We need to contain, eradicate, and recover. If you're familiar with the incident response process, those things are not new to you. In order to do that, there's a few things that I would do with the information that I have here to then push forward my response. I'd want to isolate the endpoint that had these evil things on it. You can do that a number of different ways, depends on your tooling. If you have an EDR, you can probably just press a button. Depending on your setup, you could block it on the network, or you just pull the Ethernet plug, do it the old-fashioned way. So isolating that endpoint is really important. The next thing I would want to do is ban any of those indicators of compromise that we saw. Don't ban regserve32. That would be a bad day. That while we said indicator of compromise, we have found that is a legitimate file by Microsoft. There are some fun situations where you can ban regserve32, but I won't talk about that right now. No, I won't. So we'd want to ban that Excel hash. We'd want to ban that DLL if we can, and then delete those off the endpoint. And we also want to understand, is there anywhere else this is happening in our environment? Because if it's on one endpoint, it's probably going to be on other endpoints, especially the fact that this was delivered through an email based on our information about Emotet. People definitely don't open weird attachments or links. We don't have an industry based on that somewhere. So that's likely we're going to find some others and then repeat our process of isolate that endpoint. And if we're looking for that, we're probably going to find multiple endpoints, isolate them all at once. And then we move into, we want to kill those malicious processes, perhaps, depending upon our response, delete those files. Now we get into a question of how do we best eradicate and recover? Do we go into each of these devices and manually clean up everything this file did? Or do we just reimage the box? It really depends. It depends on what actions were taken. It depends on how comfortable you are manually cleaning up a device. It depends on how much time you have on your hands. I'm lazy. I'm going to reimage the box because it's probably going to take significantly less time to do that than to go through and manually clean up everything this malware did. Are there situations in which you would manually clean it up? I think so. And that's valid. But that's important stuff to do. The other pieces, which I said we come back to, is, hey, this was probably distributed via email, which means you probably have this sitting in inboxes. This means you probably could then do another investigation here of, okay, do I have this hash in my inboxes? Who is the sender of those emails? What was the source IP or domain? And then can I block those things at my email gateway to stop this in the future? Bit of whack-a-mole there because you're using those like lower level indicators of compromise, but still you're helping yourself a bit there. And then you can rip those emails out of inboxes and make sure nobody else is sitting with danger in their inbox and you don't have a bad day 3 days from now when somebody is like, I was out of office and I got this attachment that said summer budget and opened it. And you're like, oh God, not again. So keep that in mind. All right. So in this situation so far, we've had like sunshine and rainbows. We've had all the information. We've had everything go really well, which we all know is the case every time you have something happen in your environment. You get all the data. Everything is bannable and you can figure it out just like that, right? Ooh, no head nods. Cool. All right. So that's not the case. So what if? What if we don't have all the information? What if we need to ask more questions to understand what exactly we're dealing with? This is where we go down the rabbit hole. This is where we start to ask more probing questions to better inform ourselves and make a good decision. I like to think of an alert almost as like a hypothesis, and then you investigate that hypothesis and prove or disprove it. And sometimes when you go through the scientific process, you have to add more questions to better understand things and your hypothesis changes. Thank you for coming to your 8th grade science class. The first thing that I usually ask is, what else happened in that process tree? So we have that process tree of Excel, regserve into that spider web of really good stuff. And because we are good analysts, we wrote down the hashes of all those things in our notebook, and we're going to go look those up now. We didn't write them down because that would be foolish. We put them in a notepad and we're going to copy and paste because we're efficient. So we check those out. That could probably give us some more information about what we're dealing with. For example, if the first 2 hashes didn't produce any information. The other thing that I didn't show in that process tree because it was really noisy and horrible was some of those things had network connections. So you'd get IP addresses out of that, which could also be a potential indicator of compromise to dig into to give you more information about what's happening. You could check that IP on VirusTotal. And there's a bunch of other tools for checking IP addresses. I didn't write any down, so I'm sorry I can't list them off the top of my head. But you're going to get information there. Perhaps you get something that's like a newly registered domain. That's kind of interesting. Why is this brand new domain being connected to by people in my organization? They don't normally go to like this type of stuff. Or perhaps it's just flat out malicious, and then you get that information, which is great. All right, that's good. What if we don't get information there? What if we don't get more details? We ask the ever important question of where did it come from? Where did it go? And now the song's stuck in your head and you're very welcome. But these are two very good questions to ask, because if you can understand where it came from, then you can probably figure out, is this evil or not? So with this, in this situation, you say, okay, did this happen around the same time as like my user opening something in Outlook? Did they go off to a website? Is there a Chrome process that shows a file download of this Excel file? These are all things that you can dig into to understand, where did this come from? Am I dealing with something bad? Sometimes it doesn't answer the question though, and you're like, well, it just looks like somebody opened an attachment. I got nothing. All right, where did it go? Which connects back. I keep doing that. Oh my God. Connects back to the process tree and where did it go? You can check that process tree, but sometimes that doesn't have all the answers. And I would highly advise looking at the things around that process in your data. So sometimes you can see other things that happen around the same time. Go like plus 5 minutes and dig into that information. And you can see, are there other weird things happening on the computer that make me think this was a malicious behavior to start this? There's times where I've been in situations where I get an alert like this. It looks weird and you're like, all right, but nothing bad happened off of these processes necessarily. But if you widen your scope and you look at all the things happening in that period of time and what's happening after that alert fired, it's like this process touched LSAS or something dumped creds. And it's like, oh, that's weird. That probably shouldn't be happening. And you get that clear indication of evil on the box. So answer that question. Where did it come from? Where did it go? The next thing is, okay, if those don't help us, we need to dig in and understand, is this normal? Like maybe this just happens. Maybe this is a thing that happens on these devices and that's okay. In this example, probably not, because we found out that it is evil. But I've been in situations similarly where Excel does something that looks really weird, like really weird. And you're like, okay, it's opening, like it's loading script files or something along those lines. It like access something on the system. Why is it doing that? And you can't necessarily make the determination this is a threat. So you have to go and check historical data to see, hey, maybe is this normal for this user? Does Excel normally do this for this person? And that can really be helpful. I've been in situations where you do that and then you start to realize, oh, the other things that I'm seeing on the system also indicate that like maybe this person works in finance. And when they open up Excel and do their job, it loads a bunch of random add-ons and things to make those add-ons function. And this is totally fine. And then finance gets to keep their weird Excel add-ons because they need to do their job so you get paid and you can't tell them no. Or you don't get an answer and you say, okay, maybe is this normal for the computer? Is this normal for the environment? And widening those scopes out can really help you understand, is this evil or not? There have been situations where I thought, hey, maybe this is normal. This looks like it could be. And I just need to understand if it is spread across the organization or not. And if it is, then I probably have a false positive here. And then I go check the whole organization. It's only happening on that one computer. And I'm like, well, that's weird. This is probably bad. Or at least worth like connecting with somebody about to do further analysis. So that's the rabbit hole. Let's recap. What did we do here? What are the things that we looked into? What as analysts did we accomplish here? So we evaluated, what is this alert saying? What is it telling us? Which is important to understand because you need to understand the hypothesis that you're operating under to investigate. And some alerts titles suck. And you have to like kind of pull them apart to understand what they mean. So it's a good skill to practice. And it helps you keep in check as you're investigating too, to say like, oh, what am I actually supposed to be looking into here? All right. The next thing we did is we found some indicators of compromise. We found some file hashes to look at. We found some different process names that we could look at. And we took those, used open source tooling to see what was up. We found regserve32 is clean and we could close our incident. Just kidding. And we found the 2 hashes that were very clearly evil. After that, we worked to understand who our threat was, which is identifying malware family or something along those lines. And then we took that information to understand what our threat was. What was the potential impact to our organization if this thing continues to operate? And that influences how we deal with that threat. Then we respond, contain, eradicate. We jump in and we start blasting. It's my favorite part about this whole thing. We get to get the bad guys out of our environment. And then just talking through some of those what if questions. Really like to highlight the where did it come from? Where did it go? Just let that stick into your brain. As an analyst, that's such a like 2 really helpful questions to ask as you're investigating and you run into situations where you're not sure what's happening. All this stuff, similar content is on a blog. You can check it out right now. It's on Red Canary's website. I'll put my slides in the Discord as well once I figure out how to do that. But there is a blog up. So if you lose the slides, you can just hop on Red Canary's website. Okay. I really appreciate you all coming and listening to me talk about this. I know it's not some kind of wizardry. It's nothing next level, but I think it's important. And I think it's something that needs to be talked about. Hopefully you all got something out of this and it was educational. And come find me, say hello. I'm open to feedback. Yeah. And we can argue about the things that I said we could argue about. With that, any questions? Just going to repeat the question. So talking through some of the like tooling to like check out indicators of compromise. Have I ever used URL scan IO? Yes, I have used that. I found it really helpful to like, especially not in my current role, but like previous roles where I was investigating a lot of phishing stuff. It made it really helpful to go see like, what did my users potentially land on and what could they have interacted with? And I always really liked using that tool. I found it useful. Yeah. All right. So the question was, with those types of services, specifically like URL scan, there's the public and the private scan. Can you trust the private scan? Do I know? I don't know. I don't have a good answer. If anybody else does, though, that would be great. I err on the side of caution, personally, just because the work I do could potentially be customers' data, and I don't want to mess with that. And then there's the question of if you do a scan, are you interacting with adversary infrastructure in some way, shape, or form? Do you want to do that? Probably not. Let somebody else do it. I don't know. That's tough. I'm not sure if that private scan is or how private it is. Obviously, URL scan is going to have that data. Yeah. So the question was around the attribution stuff. So do I think that if I could attribute it to a threat actor on top of a malware family or aside from a malware family, would that give me indicators of compromise on things to look into from an investigative standpoint? Easy answer, yes. I think it would. I think it definitely would give me information that would be helpful to investigating that threat and what I was dealing with. The reason I hesitate to like move into the attribution to a like particular threat actor group or something along those lines is you can kind of get bogged down in the data there and end up maybe getting stale indicators or get caught up looking for behavior stuff that might not be necessarily helpful in that situation, but I think that's one of those things you can dig into. I'm not saying don't do that, but it's not really in my methodology to attribute it to that threat actor more so than a malware family. And I might be saying one thing in my presentation, saying one thing right here, but like is that going to change how you respond knowing who or what it is sometimes? Maybe, maybe not. And I think that's an important thing to ask is like, if you're dealing with, like the 5 commodity malwares that are really big, does knowing which one I'm dealing with necessarily change my response? Maybe, maybe not. It just depends. Typically not though. Like isolate, ban, kill, blast the evil stuff. Whereas like if you're dealing with a threat actor group and that might change how you deal with things a little bit.
Kellon, we have a question from Discord.
Yeah.
And my apologies for using the wrong pronouns in your intro. I realized it right now. So this is it's got 3 parts to the question, but it's saying how much autonomy does Red Canary have for actions like endpoint isolation or other invasive actions? And this person says, I realize it may depend on the contractual agreement, but what is typical?
So very correct. It does deal with contractual stuff, but a lot of what we do is basically sitting in the passenger seat with somebody who's dealing with a really bad day or a potential really bad day. And we get to advise them like, hey, isolate this endpoint. Hey, ban these hashes, do these things, jump into your live response console if you have one, and take these actions, which is really cool. So it's hands off, but we get to almost be hands on. And then there's some customers where we are hands on, but majority of it is that advisement piece. Was there? Oh, my bad. Sorry. So the question was, how do you help a new analyst determine when they should escalate an alert? That's a really good question. I like that because I've been in that situation. And you're like, is this bad enough to push to tier 2 or can I deal with it? Or is it nothing at all? Like, what do I do here? And like, I think the thing that is probably the most helpful is, this is going to be kind of like a weird squishy answer, and I'm sorry, but it's going to be about culture, is building a culture where your analysts feel comfortable to ask questions and like reach over to the person next to them or send a Slack to the person and understand like, if they're unsure about escalating, they can ask that question and it's not a problem. Building that culture where it's okay to say, I don't know, and where it's not a failure to ask those questions is really good. And a culture where if they do escalate, it's not a failure on their part that they escalated that and potentially wasted the time of their tier 2 analyst. God, I need to wasted the time of their tier 2 analysts. Because I think that's a thing that can happen is there's that feeling, but it doesn't need to be there. So building that culture and then just encouraging them to say, I don't know, and ask those questions. Because if you're new, if you're entry, like you should be asking questions. And if you're not, perhaps management should note that and then figure out why questions aren't being asked and create a better environment where questions can be asked. That's my hot take. Thank you all so much.